I bought this cheap filament runout sensor thinking it was my overnight insurance policy. A printer spool needs just 50 more grams of filament on it, no problem. This will pause my print, I can replace it, everything resumes. And initially, it worked just like magic. If I was sitting at my desk and the print paused, all I had to do was swap out that filament, hit resume, and it would continue the print flawlessly. But then the real test occurred. One night at 2 a.m., my printer stopped. It was out of filament. In the morning, I put a new spool on, hitting resume, thinking it would continue just like it had previously. Only I get an error that I must home the axes first before I can resume the print. There's no way for me to save that 20-hour print. And this is where I realized that Klipper, by default, within 10 minutes of your printer being paused, it's going to cut all power to your stepper motors. And your printer's going to forget where they are, which means there is no hope of resuming that print. And this is where off-the-shelf printers will handle this pause and resume differently. They will keep your bed heated and your motors powered for days. Why? Well, because it can't let the bed cool down, otherwise the print may pop off of it. And if it powers off the motors, it's going to lose their placement and it can't resume the print. So it just sits there and waits patiently for you to replace that spool. Now, I initially thought that I would just modify Klipper so that the idle time didn't wait 10 minutes, but it would wait 8 hours. That presents me with another problem, a major fire hazard, because I'm going to have a nozzle that's sitting at somewhere between 190 and 210 degrees if I'm printing with PLA for who knows how long. And as that nozzle remains hot, any filament that's in it continues to cook and will just clog my printer when I try and resume. So I modified the macro to turn the nozzle off the second the printer is paused. But this kind of created a different problem. See, when I went back to the printer to pull that filament out of the nozzle and replace it with a new spool, I wasn't able to get the filament out of the nozzle because I hadn't retracted it. So I ended up having to heat the nozzle up to be able to pull that filament out, which did work, but isn't ideal. But then I ran into a second problem because when I resumed the printer was just crawling now as if it was permanently set on a very, very slow acceleration. So the first thing I did was I tackled the frozen filament. And what I did was I made sure that when configuring Klipper and it pauses, after it turns the nozzle off, it immediately retracts 2 millimeters quickly and then 10 millimeters slowly. And this makes sure that the filament that's in the hot end is outside the heat zone so that when I come back to replace the spool, I can pull that little piece of filament out without having to heat up the hot end. So what caused the brutal slow motion bug right after we resumed? Well, this happened because of feed rate. See, feed rate in Klipper is a global variable. And when we resume the print, we set the feed rate very, very slowly so that we can just bleed a little bit of filament. And the reason we do that is to make sure the nozzle is all primed and ready to go. Well, what happens is that feed rate then is used for the rest of the print because Klipper doesn't want to, on every single layer, reset all of the feed rates. So to fix this, we use something built into Klipper called save G-code state and restore G-code state. So right before we pause the print, we save the G-code state. And then right after we resume the print and we're ready to start printing, we restore the G-code state. So this lets the macro pause the print, do a slow purge to make sure we have filament in the nozzle, but then set the entire printer speeds back to normal before we resume the print. I wanted to see how this worked. I wasn't willing to just let my printer sit there for 8 hours on. So I do have it set to 8 hours because I didn't want it to run for days and days and days. If I don't change the spool in 8 hours, I'm either on vacation, which the printer should turn off, or worse. So I don't need the print anymore. But I did want to test this. So what I ended up doing is I ended up setting up my printer and having it run a print. And then I manually cut the filament just to test and see what would happen. I gave it the 10 minutes for the idle timeout, and I was able to see the nozzle return to a safe temperature. Then I tried to pull the filament, it pulled no problem. I replaced it with the new filament and it started and resumed the print perfectly. So I had a perfect finished print. The only thing I'm still wondering about is that little purge of filament. How necessary is that? If you want, in the description below, I have a gist that is my printer config for these macros and what I set the pause and the resume to and how I have that configured. But I'm interested in your macros as well. What do you do differently than what I'm doing here? And do you use that slow filament purge, or do you cut that out entirely? Leave a comment below and let me know. In the meantime, I hope all your prints adhere to your bed and your layer lines are almost invisible.